John Blaxland, thank you very much for joining me here on Newsnight. I want to ask you first of all about the morality of war. When we look at the history of war, you go back to the gassings in World War I, the German Blitz in World War II, the bombing of Dresden, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, even through to today with the use of chemical weapons or drone attacks. Is there a morality in war? Can you even argue for morality in war?
I certainly think there is scope for talking about proportionality. It's important to reflect on the fact that war is an extension of politics by other means, and so you have to think about the political objectives and the nature of the political state that is engaging in the conflict. And a government can't pursue a military campaign unless it has the backing of its people sufficiently to the point where they can pull off what they want to pull off. But in a country like the United States, you really do need to have a degree of authority from the people, and that certainly applies to Australia too. And we see that in the way our Parliament works. When we have a conflict that we're looking to be involved in, there is a strong policy traction from people on both sides of politics, from all across society as well, as they have a stake in what's taking place.
And when you talk about proportionality, is there not a risk though that if it's your side, then the means justify the end? If it's the other side, then it's abuse?
Well, there's no question that the victors get to write the story. And if you think about what happened in the Second World War, you touched on it, the fire bombings of Dresden, of Tokyo, the use of nuclear weapons, the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The people who had those weapons employed against them certainly weren't writing much of the story. In fact, they were essentially written off. It's interesting as we reflect on the experience on the Pakistan-Afghanistan border today, where we are seeing the use of precision in weapons technology from drones in particular that is incredibly discriminating compared to what we saw only a generation ago, where we would firebomb a whole city. Today we're looking to pick out an individual through the window of a building even with an explosive device that's actually got limited impact. And that is supported with the level of intelligence that's unprecedented in the history of warfare. And yet even so, we're seeing very strong reactions, and some people, are saying, well, we're not going far enough in trying to constrain the use of force, and others would argue, well, actually, you haven't gone far enough, and so it's really tricky. You've got a country like the United States using drones in an attempt to deal with individual so-called terrorists or extremists operating across the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan and in other parts of the Middle East as well.
And then you get a situation of the moral equivalence where people in the Islamic world will point to the United States killing civilians with the use of drones and then say, well, how can you lecture us about our methods of war, even if that may involve chemical weapons?
Well, this is the thing. It really is very tricky to regain the moral high ground in a conflict like this when you're killing people, and there doesn't seem to be anyone coming up with a viable alternative to the courses of action that are presented. And you think about the courses of action that President Obama has taken. When he took office, he was very high, talking about very high moral principles about the way the United States would conduct operations once he became president. Of course, the reality is that it's actually very hard for him to make a big change because of the political realities on the ground. The bottom line is that the United States has felt compelled to act against these operatives moving across the border, and yet the effect at the tactical and operational level has been incredible. They've essentially decapitated large swathes of terrorist groups. But at the strategic level, the effect has been extremely corrosive because it's breeding another generation of people who hate the West, hate the United States, who are basically committing their lives to pursue the downfall of the United States and of the West.
And then we get to the morality of intervention, and as you say before, for any military action to succeed or be justified, it needs the support of the people, the domestic support of the people at home. But when you have a compelling case, whether it be ethnic cleansing that has taken place in some parts of the world, or what we're seeing in Syria right now, how does a country like the United States decides, yes, I will intervene here in a place like Libya, or we'll go to war in Afghanistan, but we won't intervene in Syria?
Well, the Syrian situation is really, really complicated. You've got a couple of big factors that are driving the situation there. One is the traditional Sunni-Shia split in the Middle East. And it's one that people in the West, in Australia, really don't have much of an understanding of, generally speaking. And of course that's complicated because you've got a country like Iran, that is a Shia country predominantly, supporting the Assad regime in Syria, and it's getting backing from Hezbollah in Lebanon as well, which is another Shiite group. And of course you've then got large swathes of the Sunni Middle East, in particular Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and other parts of the Middle East as well, such as Egypt, that are primarily Sunni, that don't want to see the Shiites come out on top. So there's yet another layer, which is of course the great power, the traditional great power rivalry between the United States and Russia, what was the Soviet Union. But the Russians are playing a pretty strong hand in this arrangement as well. And of course that means that the stakes are pretty high. The stakes are really big because we're talking about a potential rejigging of the map of the Middle East in terms of the Sunni-Shia split, in terms of Russian influence, in terms of even Iranian influence, and with Iran looking down the barrel at having nuclear weapons in the foreseeable future. This is altering the dynamics to a point where the United States is at the juncture where it really feels it can't just sit and watch.
And John, that then raises issues about moral hypocrisy when the US has intervened in some conflicts as it chooses and not in others, and now we see a situation after more than a decade of war in Afghanistan where there's talk of sitting down with the Taliban, the very enemy they went in there to oust from power. It must raise a lot of questions of moral confusion.
Yeah, well, the bottom line is you've got to deal with the reality on the ground. It's very difficult. 12 years after the event of 9/11 and of the original invasion of Afghanistan, and all that's gone in between, the suffering on all sides, to come up with a plan that's going to work, that's going to salvage some kind of respect for all those involved, that's going to actually help find a way out of the problem as well. It's really vexed, and there's no easy answers. So the issue of hypocrisy, I think it's a convenient and easy line to throw around, but you've got to deal with real choices. And what does the United States, what does Australia, what does the West do now? I mean, you can't undo the past. We have to deal with the world as it is today, and what realistic options are there on the table? And there aren't that many. And one of the most compelling ones is engagement to some extent with the Taliban.
But this was a conflict, the war on terror, that was very much framed as a battle of values as well. The values of hardline Islam against the values of freedom of the West. Is morality expendable when it comes up against what is ultimately achievable?
Well, it's a fine line. It's a fine balance between maintaining the moral stance that you want to maintain and worrying about the corrosive effects on your sides, on the cause that you fight for, if you don't maintain those standards. And we're seeing that, the repercussions of Guantanamo Bay, of Abu Ghraib prison, of various other very public manifestations of the United States and the West's moral authority being corroded and undermined. These are very hard to get away from, very, very difficult situations that you can't unravel them, you can't undo them, you can only work towards making progress from where you are today and try and make good choices, the best choices. And the other thing is, it's all grey. There's no black and no white in this situation. There are shades of grey, and it's very difficult to know in advance which policy option is going to be the most effective. It's easy to look back in hindsight and say, 11 years ago we should have done things differently. But it didn't look that way back in 2002. When we were in Afghanistan back then, we, the West, Australia, the United States and other countries, it looked like it was a lay-down misère. It was victorious, things had worked out well, we could brush off our hands and move on. And of course, President Bush back then thought it was wise to go into Iraq, and we all know what an absolute fiasco that's turned out to be.
John, finally, there are rules of war, of course. There are the Geneva Conventions, and they have provisions to protect civilians from being caught up in conflict, being killed in conflict. But ultimately, are those rules of war just irrelevant when it comes down to fighting on the ground and having to choose your battles? As you said before, the pragmatism involved in trying to have the best possible outcome of these conflicts.
Look, those rules of war are absolutely essential for a democracy like Australia. They are absolutely vital. And in the Australian Defence Force, I'm confident to say the rules of war are pretty closely adhered to. In fact, it's scrupulously adhered to. I'm a former Army officer myself, and am privy to the way that the Australian Defence Force operates in this domain, and it is really world standard in terms of probity, in terms of rigour of its processes to try and identify the legitimacy of a target before engaging a target, and in providing opportunities for capture rather than death. And so it's very tricky. But for our side, for Australian soldiers in particular, as you think about those coming back from Afghanistan, they need to have confidence that their government has put them in a place where what they're doing is as good as they can, and that their people, the people of Australia, will respect them for what they did. And to do that, they've actually got to be confident that what they're doing is as honourable, is as correct, is as sticking to the rules as best as possible. Now that puts Australian soldiers sometimes in a very tricky position, whereby they actually put themselves at greater risk in some sense than the Taliban they're fighting against do, because they're fighting to a higher standard. And this is actually a very important principle that is the Australian Defence Force, as limited as its contribution has been, it has rigorously stuck to. And it's interesting, just the number of studies that have been conducted, the post-operations investigations that are done by legal officers and investigating officers to verify that when somebody has died in a clash, that the Australian soldiers involved have followed the rules to the letter. And we're actually remarkably strict about it. Now, this is something I think Australians can be relatively proud of. I mean, the bottom line is that the situation in Afghanistan today is grey. It's not white, it's not black, it's very, very grey. We can only hope that the contribution that our soldiers are making there today will actually facilitate a modicum of peace and stability as the forces of ISAF withdraw next year.
John, a terrific conversation. I really appreciate you coming on the program. Thank you again.
My pleasure.